I got everything on and working here. Hi, my name's Elliot. Before I start talking to you about games and music, I first want to thank all of you for being here, and also want to thank Jessica Erickson and Erica Neerman for putting the time and effort into putting this event together and being open to this topic. So can we have another round of applause for that, please? All right, so creating a game's musical aesthetic. Why am I talking to you about this topic? Well, I'm here because I like to wear suits and talk into microphones. And on top of that, I'm, like Erica said, a composer and sound designer here in Chicago. I've released a number of albums as the electronic artist from MOVA. I'm an executive composer and producer in the 2020 Music Group, a collective of composers, musicians, and audio artists here in Chicago. I'm faculty in the game and film program at DePaul, and I'm also a lieutenant in the Army National Guard, so shout out to the 1744th Warriors. Hooah. Okay. I want to begin by talking about some of the differences between composing for the concert stage as opposed to composing for a game. Now, this is very distilled and incredibly oversimplified, but at a bare minimum, a concert composer is concerned with instrumentation, aesthetic, and probably has some length requirements for a piece that they compose. It's then approved by the commissioning entity, and then we get a bunch of incredibly talented instrumentalists into a room. They practice and perform the work. As a game composer, we're still concerned with instrumentation and aesthetic, but we also have to be concerned with precise timings. We may be scoring a cinematic, or maybe the music has to line up with a specific animation of a character or event in the game. Function. Are we trying to set a location, place, or are we trying to set a mood? Or are we communicating the use of a game mechanic? Implementation. Is the music looping continuously, or is it going to play throughout its entire duration? Or is it going to play and then abruptly be cut off by something? And do we need to make multiple variations of the music because we're creating an adaptive score? Most composers and sound designers that work in games are also having to be their own mixing and mastering engineers as well. Most game music is made using virtual instrument technology, so you need to be adept in mixing and mastering and general audio skills. We're also concerned with the amount of data that we have available. If we're writing music for a game that's on a smartphone, we don't have as much actual storage that we can use as opposed to, say, a console or PC title. And then lastly, promotion. Many times the music that we write is going to be used to promote the game itself too, and subsequently the studio. So when you keep all of this in mind and you write all of the music, it then needs to be approved by the game developer as well as the publisher, and then we're finally able to put out the music and the game into the world, and wonderful, amazing things happen. So just a quick side-by-side comparison there. In addition, as a game composer, you need to speak multiple languages. Not only do you need to speak the languages of music and audio, but you definitely need to speak the language of game. Ultimately, you are trying to help the game developer's vision happen, and their primary language is game. So if you can't speak that language, you're not going to do a lot to help their vision happen. And they're going to try and talk about music and audio, and sometimes you're lucky and they know that language very well. And sometimes you really need to help them articulate what their vision really is. So you also need to act as an interpreter and translator for that process. But essentially, the process you'll go through will be somewhat similar to this. You'll discuss aesthetics, style, ideas, implementation, and again, you may have to go through somewhat of an interpretation process, but once you have all of this information consolidated, you then need to translate it into musical language, or you've got a bunch of stuff, and now you need to use that stuff to write music. And there's no set-in-stone way that you go about this. In fact, it's usually different for every specific project you work on. So I'm going to talk about 3 games that I worked on. Space Scavengers, where harmonic motion of the music was determined by pictures and specific word selection. Project Frequency, where we focused on the intended feeling of the player. And Boats High Seas Scramble, where I was lucky enough to have a dedicated audio person on the team that had a music background and spoke my language. And our conversations became integral in making that music happen. So let's start with Space Scavengers. Who here knows or has participated in a global game jam? Right, a couple hands, cool. So for those that aren't aware, a global game jam is where people around the world create 4 to 8 person teams, and in the span of 48 hours, they're given a theme and they make a game. And incredible, amazing things are made in these 48-hour caffeine-fueled, bloodshot eye development sessions. But Space Scavengers was made from a global game jam, and this means that very early on a Saturday, they were talking to me about writing music for a game that didn't exist yet. They sort of kind of had an idea of what they wanted it to become. So this is an early quote they sent me. It's a 2D 4-player roguelike game that has the players visiting various sci-fi settings like abandoned space stations, ships infested with alien insects, and maybe even planets. They then sent me a couple of images of celestial settings to give me an idea of the mood that they're going for. And then they also, talking specifically about the music, said piano, synthy, maybe an orchestra, swell at the beginning, then calmer afterward. And I know it's kind of funny, but honestly, like, this is the kind of feedback you're going to get. Take it very seriously. And then they also gave me 4 keywords: mysterious, floating, calm, and wondrous. And I have wondrous bolded because it relates to a pet project of mine that became the main motivator for the music of Space Scavengers. And the idea of this pet project of mine is that specific harmonic motion or chord changes have a emotion or meaning or specific word tied to them. The idea being that moving from a major 1 or a tonic to a minor 2 or the subdominant has a specific word and meaning assigned to it. The more harmonic motion we have, so the more chord changes we have, the more words we now have to describe that progression. And I by no means think this could ever be some infallible encyclopedia of music and emotion, but if you're having a discussion with someone who doesn't usually talk about music, it's a fantastic way to begin a conversation. And I bring it up because the very first word that I assigned to any harmonic motion was the word wondrous. And for me personally, movement from a minor 1, so a minor tonic, to a major 4 is the musical personification of the word wondrous. And on its own, it sounds like this. So at this point, I have this progression that I know I want to make the focal point of the composition. I've got all of these images that they've given me, as well as the descriptors that they emailed me as well. So with all of this in mind, I created the main theme for the game, Space Scavengers. So while Space Scavengers was about exploring the mysterious and unknown with a sense of wonder and awe, Project Frequency was about exploring the mysterious and unknown and getting the crap scared out of you. Such an exaggerated mouth shake there. Discussion on the music for this game began with discussions like this. The world needs to have music that fits with the whole solitary, mysterious feel of the atmosphere. Everything is filled with fog, no one is seen, only monsters. The Silent Hill 2 soundtrack would be an awesome reference. And I played Silent Hill 2 way back in the day, but was far more concerned with Pyramid Head than I was about smelling the musical flowers along the way. So I spent some time on YouTube and Google and was blown away by these ugly, dissonant, disgusting, tense. I'm just going to play a montage of some of the music from the game. Awesome, right? So I had these atmospheres and textures in the back of my mind, and I talked to the developer a bit more about the game and the gameplay, and he sent me an early build of it so I could play it too. A bit about the gameplay: it's set in an open world in a dream purgatory hell kind of place, and the only goal is to survive. which is made more difficult because all of the items and enemies are completely randomly generated. You can walk into a building and it can be full of monsters one time, and then tomorrow you can play the game and go to the same exact building and it can be full of items and health packs and things that actually make your life easier. The key takeaway is that it's different every time you play, and because of that, there's very little that you can assume or rely upon when you're playing this game. And because of that, when I was playing through an early build, I realized that all of the time when nothing was really happening in the game was still actually pretty tense because you didn't know so much about what was happening around you. And I really grasped onto that. So my goal with the score became to make the player scared when nothing is happening. So how do we do this? For Project Frequency, we had constant low frequency sound. There have actually been studies that show that humans have an illicit reaction to infrasonic sound, or sound that is so low it's below the threshold of human hearing, that just makes us very tense and anxious. And that just sounds fun, right? Perfect for Project Frequency. On top of that, I wanted to go even further with this idea of removing a sense of control. So if you can't rely on items or enemies being in the same place, audio can do a lot to really help you feel like you're back in the driver's seat. You hear something to your left, you now know to be cautious about that. You're going to approach that situation differently. And I wanted the player to be as helpless as possible. So I added seemingly random percussion in the soundtrack so that if they hear something, it's not necessarily something in the game. And after a certain time, you begin to almost ignore what you're hearing, which puts you in very tense and threatening situations that maybe you would have been more cautious about otherwise. So I have a short gameplay clip here, and even though nothing really happens in this clip, pay attention to how tense and heavy it still feels. Boats. This game is not as scary as the last one. So, some notes on the gameplay of Boats. It's multiplayer, it's ship combat, and it's fun, lighthearted, and family-friendly. You can see by the color palette and the art style, this is much more inviting than Project Frequency. And I worked very closely with a dedicated audio person on the team, and they had a background in music, so they spoke my language, and they just needed a trained composer to execute their ideas. So the guidance I received from him became very important. Early conversation we had was, I originally was prototyping more epic, ambient, and battle tracks inspired by world music, but over the past weeks we have seen the gameplay become much more arcadey and comical, so I think a shift in direction and scope will be necessary. It needs to be epic, exciting, and capture a really adventurous and upbeat feeling we're looking for. Mix of high seas Royal Navy and jolly drunken music. And I want you to pay attention to how dense this is with descriptors that really help me know what they're looking for. Words like epic, exciting, adventurous, upbeat. High Seas Royal Navy immediately tells me specific instrumentation, and jolly drunken music, again, just helps me get an idea of that overall aesthetic that they want. So with the gameplay clips they sent me, as well as these discussions, I took my first stab at the music for Boats. So I sent that off to the dev team, and their audio guy got back to me. Overall, the drum, strings, and low brass in the background seem to work very well. Notice he's talking about specific sections in the orchestra. Incredibly helpful. The orchestral crashes might be a bit much, but this is definitely on the right track. For the next pass, I would look into bringing out an apparent melody into the fold to really nail this playful, silly experience we're going for. During our work sessions, the team has been listening to Celtic and tavern music. So this tells me that what I have, it's working. We just need to expand upon it to really make it finished and ready for the game. But we need to make it feel more like a tavern. We need to add a strong melody, and we need to make it feel more Celtic. And so let's take these one at a time. I don't think you could ever fit an entire orchestra into any neighborhood tavern. For the sake of using what I had already, but yet still trying to get more of a tavern feel, I added another section to the piece that has scaled back instrumentation. So it doesn't have, an entire orchestra on a concert stage. It has a single guitar, our main melodic instrument, and a little bit of percussion. The idea being that I wanted to emulate the idea of someone hearing that their friends are going to the pub down the street, they go to the living room, dust off their guitar, and bring it with them and have a really fun time playing all their favorite songs on a Friday night. So I did that tavern section, and then I kind of did a two birds, one stone sort of thing. I needed to add a strong melody, and I needed to make it sound more Celtic. So what I did was I made my main melodic instrument Uilleann pipes. And I don't know how historically accurate this is, but for me personally, when I hear the timbre of Uilleann pipe, that immediately feels Celtic to me. So two birds, one stone. I've got a melody. It sounds more Celtic. We've got a section that sounds like it's more in a tavern setting, and we're still using the main foundation that I had written already. And so when all of this came together, I sent it off, and it became the main theme for Boats. Thank you, everyone, for listening to me talk about games and music. I'm as excited as the rest of you to hear Dan Forden tell us about the music and audio systems in Injustice 2. If you'd like to stay in touch, there's my email address and website. And thank you again so much for being here. I really appreciate it. Have a great night.